The bell above the door rang, like a gunshot, the morning Margot Ashworth walked into Reeves' auto shop, with a resume shaking in her hand, and exactly $43 left in her bank account. She had rehearsed the interview a dozen times in her car, but nothing prepared her for the man behind the counter who looked up, wiped grease from his knuckles, and said the words that would append her entire life. "I need a wife, not an employee." She stood frozen, certain she had misheard him, certain this was some cruel joke, but the exhaustion in his eyes told her he meant every word, and that morning became the first thread in a story neither of them saw coming. Before we go further, if you believe in second chances, in kindness finding people at their lowest, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's continue. Margot hadn't come to Reeves' auto shop looking for romance or complication. She had come because the classifieds listed an opening for a part-time bookkeeper, and she desperately needed the income after losing her job at the accounting firm 3 months earlier when the company downsized. She was 29, recently divorced, and living in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, counting coins for gas money. The shop belonged to Callum Reeve, a 34-year-old widower, who had been raising his 6-year-old daughter, Wren, alone since his wife passed away from a sudden illness 2 years prior. Callum's hands were perpetually stained with motor oil, his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights, and his shop, though respected for honest work, was drowning in unpaid invoices and tangled paperwork he had no time or patience to sort through. When Margot handed him her resume that morning, Callum barely glanced at it. He was distracted, holding a phone to his ear with his shoulder while trying to explain to Wren's kindergarten teacher why he'd missed the parent conference again. When he finally hung up, frustration etched deep into his face, he looked at Margot and blurted out the sentence that made her heart stop, not out of romantic intention, but out of sheer exhaustion. He explained, stumbling over his own words, that he didn't just need someone to balance books. He needed someone who could help him hold his entire fractured life together, the way a wife might have, the way his late wife once had. He apologized almost immediately, embarrassed, insisting he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, but Margot saw something raw and unguarded in that moment, something she recognized because she too had been drowning quietly for months. Despite the awkward start, Margot took the job. She told herself it was simply about survival, about needing money for rent, but from her very first day, she saw how deeply this small family was struggling. Wren was a bright, curious child, but she often came to the shop after school with her shoelaces untied and her hair uncombed, waiting on an old couch in the corner while her father juggled customers, invoices, and phone calls all at once. Margot began by simply organizing the shop's chaotic files, but within weeks she found herself tying Wren's shoes, packing her snacks, and helping her with homework at a small desk near the parts counter. Callum noticed, though he said little, his gratitude expressed only through the small nod he gave her at the end of each day. The weeks that followed revealed the quiet architecture of Callum's grief. Margot learned, through fragments Wren innocently shared and through moments Callum let slip when exhaustion wore down his guard, that his wife, Adeline, had died suddenly from a brain aneurysm while making breakfast one ordinary morning. Callum had been left not only heartbroken, but completely unprepared to run a household, raise a child, and manage a business simultaneously. He had tried hiring help before, but nothing lasted. People came for a paycheck and left when the emotional weight became too heavy. Margot began to understand that his blunt words on her first day weren't inappropriate. They were the desperate honesty of a man who had nothing left to hide behind. As autumn deepened, Margot found herself staying later than her shift required, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to be there. She watched Callum interact with customers, patient and fair even when business was slow, and she watched him with Wren, gentle despite his own unhealed wounds. She began to feel something she hadn't expected, not pity, but admiration, and slowly, something warmer stirring beneath it. Yet she was cautious, aware of her own scars from a marriage that had ended in betrayal, and unwilling to mistake proximity for connection. She reminded herself daily that she was there to work, not to fall for a grieving widower and his daughter, but her heart, quietly and without her permission, was already leaning elsewhere. The turning point came on a bright afternoon in late October, when a routine day spiraled into crisis. Wren, running across the shop floor to show her father a drawing, slipped and struck her head against the edge of a workbench. Callum, in the middle of an engine repair, didn't see it happen, and only turned when he heard Margot's sharp cry. She had already scooped Wren into her arms, pressing a clean cloth to the small cut above her eyebrow, speaking calm reassurances even as her own hands trembled. Callum rushed over, panic flooding his face, but Margot's steady voice cut through his fear, guiding him to breathe, to focus, to drive them to the emergency room, while she held Wren steady in the back seat the entire way. At the hospital, as they waited for stitches, Callum turned to Margot, and, for the first time since she'd met him, broke down completely, admitting through tears that he didn't know how he would have survived that moment, or so many moments before it without her. That night marked a quiet, but undeniable shift. Callum began confiding in Margot more openly, sharing memories of Adeline, expressing fears about whether he was failing Wren, admitting the crushing loneliness that followed him home each night. Margot, in turn, shared pieces of her own past, the marriage that had crumbled under her ex-husband's dishonesty, the isolation she felt afterward, the fear that she might never trust anyone with her heart again. They found in each other an unexpected mirror, two people who had been broken by loss in different forms, slowly learning to breathe again in each other's presence. Winter arrived, bringing with it new warmth inside the small auto shop that had once felt so cold and overwhelmed. Margot no longer merely balanced the books. She had become woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Wren began calling her Miss Margot with a special brightness in her voice, drawing pictures of the three of them together, leaving them proudly on Margot's desk each morning. Callum, though still cautious about his heart, found himself smiling more often, lingering in conversations with Margot longer than necessary, finding reasons to walk her to her car at the end of long days. Neither spoke aloud of what was growing between them, but everyone who saw them together, from loyal customers to Callum's own weathered mechanics, could see it plainly. The moment of truth arrived on a snowy December evening, after the shop had closed and Wren had fallen asleep on the office couch, wrapped in Callum's old flannel jacket. Callum found Margot finishing the last of the month's invoices, and instead of thanking her for her work, as he had done countless times before, he sat beside her and quietly admitted that his careless words on her very first day, "I need a wife, not an employee," had turned out to be more prophetic than he ever intended. He confessed that somewhere between the tangled paperwork and shared heartbreak, he had fallen in love with her, not as a replacement for what he lost, but as someone entirely her own, someone who had given him and his daughter a reason to hope again. Margot, her eyes filling with tears she no longer tried to hide, admitted she had fallen for him too, slowly and against every guard she had built. If this story has touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that healing and love can find us in the most unexpected places. Your support means the world to us here at Wisdom Story House. Before we close this chapter, we have a special request. If you'd like to see more heartfelt stories like Margot and Callum's, comment the word hope below, so we know to keep bringing you stories that touch your heart and restore your faith in second chances. In the months that followed, Margot didn't just become the bookkeeper who saved a struggling auto shop from financial ruin. She became the heartbeat of a home that had been quietly falling apart. By the following spring, Callum proposed to her in the very shop where they'd met, surrounded by the tools and grease-streaked walls that had witnessed their entire journey, with Wren standing beside them holding a small bouquet of daisies picked from the yard. Margot said yes without hesitation, understanding now that his blunt confession on that very first day hadn't been a mistake or an inappropriate demand, but an honest cry from a broken man who needed someone willing to stay. And she had stayed, not because he needed a wife instead of an employee, but because somewhere in the grease-stained chaos of that little shop, She had found a family worth fighting for, and a love she never knew she still deserved.